Your memoir scenes don't happen in no place. They're always happening in some place in the world, even if it's a bit boring, like a bland bedroom somewhere. There's always a place. And sometimes we forget that we need to paint that picture of the place for the reader because obviously they weren't there. They couldn't see that place. And we don't want a story that necessarily could happen anywhere, anywhere in the world, in any possible room. Often those places define the story. They define what happens in that location. So we need to remember to describe it in some detail. It doesn't have to be a whole paragraph of description. It can be just a line here and there. But I want to give you an example of a rough draft of a story that is lacking in that place detail. So this was one of my students from many years ago who was writing about a trip to the Bahamas with his family. He's Canadian, goes down there, as we all do, us Canadians, we often want to get away in January, February when it's, the dead of winter. We go down to the Caribbean or whatnot. And he's down in the Bahamas with his family. And I'm not going to read the whole story, but by the end, he falls asleep by the beach and wakes up 5 hours later, and he has this massive suntan. And back at the room, he can barely move. And, it's an interesting little story. It's nothing monumental, but it is an interesting story of what happened on this family trip. And he felt he wanted to write about this. But the place being Bahamas, I've been to Bahamas a couple times, the palm trees and the white sand and the blue seas and so on, depending on your resort. There's specifics there. That is not described in this story. Also, when they show up, he says, we were all dressed up. Coming from Canada, you got your winter jacket on when you get to the airport in Canada. And then when you get to Bahamas, you got to discard all these winter clothes. And he says, we were all dressed up. Well, what does that look like? And the big problem of his time in Bahamas, the suntan, happens on the beach. But he doesn't describe the beach. He doesn't really talk about where he's sitting, who's around, and so on. We don't know what resort he's at. And these are little details that if you could add those kinds of things in, would just give a little more richness to the story. And the reader, gets a sense of where they are, what they're doing. It's so important to locate every single scene that you write. Now, the balance, sometimes the scene isn't, or the location isn't as important as others. So maybe there's a little bit of a different balance there. But I think here, given, what happened to him and the fact that he was in this hot Bahamian sun for 5 hours, I think it's important to bring more details in about the location. So keep that in mind in your own scenes. Try to get a few details in. If it's not that important to the story, just get a few details in. Now, if the place is really important, for example, you volunteered at a homeless shelter when you were 20 years old, you're really going to bring in a lot of detail about that homeless shelter so that readers feel like they're really there with you. So just a quick tip about locating and bringing in that description.